A ripple in the lake. Jake Collins woke up early to the sound of his alarm clock, the faint light of dawn spilling through the cracked blinds of his small bedroom. His day began as it always did, rolling out of bed, pulling on his well-worn sneakers, and grabbing the canvas bag filled with newspapers. Life in Crestwood was predictable, the same routine day in and day out. But Jake, 17 years old and already carrying the weight of the world, dreamed of something far greater. Crestwood was a sleepy town surrounded by endless lakes and dense forests. It was a beautiful place, but for Jake, it often felt like a trap. After losing his father at 12, Jake became the man of the house, helping his mother, Linda, who worked long hours as a motel cleaner. While others his age hung out with friends or planned vacations, Jake spent his afternoons stocking shelves of the local grocery store and his evenings studying, determined to one day escape the cycle of poverty that had defined his family for generations. He wanted to be an engineer, a builder of things that mattered. His dream was to create machines that would make life easier for people like his mom, hardworking, underappreciated, and endlessly giving. "It's not where you start, Jake," Linda would always remind him, "but where you finish." But dreams didn't pay bills, and the reality of Jake's life was a relentless grind. He was used to it. He even thrived on the challenge. Until one morning, everything changed. Jake had just finished his paper route and decided to take a detour to one of his favorite spots, a small, secluded lake about a mile from his house. It was a place where he could sit and think, surrounded by nothing but the gentle rustle of leaves and the soft ripple of water. The lake was quiet, peaceful, and free from the demands of life. As he approached, however, the tranquility shattered. A scream. A desperate, high-pitched cry for help. Jake froze for a split second, his heart pounding in his chest, before sprinting toward the sound. At the water's edge, he saw her, a girl flailing in the lake, her blonde hair slick against her pale face as she struggled to stay afloat. Without thinking, Jake kicked off his shoes and dove into the icy water. The shock of the cold hit him like a wall, but adrenaline propelled him forward. He swam as fast as he could, closing the distance between himself and the girl. By the time he reached her, her movements were weak, her energy fading. "I've got you," he said, his voice firm but soothing as he grabbed her around the waist and began the arduous swim back to shore. When they reached the bank, Jake collapsed beside her, both of them gasping for breath. He turned to her, his chest heaving, and asked, "Are you okay?" The girl nodded, her wide blue eyes filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "I think so," she whispered, her voice trembling. You saved me." It was only then that Jake recognized her, Alyssa Davenport. The name alone carried weight in Crestwood. She was the only child of Ethan Davenport, the town's wealthiest man, a real estate mogul with more money than most people could imagine. Alyssa was Crestwood royalty, living a life of luxury and privilege that seemed worlds away from Jake's reality. "What were you doing out here alone?" Jake asked, his brow furrowed in concern. Alyssa hesitated before answering. "I needed to clear my head. I didn't realize how deep the water was until it was too late." Jake shook his head. "You're lucky I was here." Alyssa managed a faint smile. "Lucky doesn't even begin to cover it." They sat in silence for a moment, the gravity of what had just happened sinking in. Finally, Alyssa spoke again. "What's your name?" Jake Collins." "I'm Alyssa," she said, though she knew he already recognized her. "I don't know how to thank you, Jake." "You don't have to," he replied, standing up and offering her a hand. "Just take care of yourself, okay?" Alyssa accepted his help, standing on shaky legs. Together, they walked back to the road where her sleek convertible sat parked, its door still ajar. The contrast between their worlds was stark, her immaculate car and designer clothes next to his worn sneakers and thrift store jacket. But in that moment, it didn't seem to matter. Before she left, Alyssa turned to Jake. "Maybe I'll see you around." "Maybe," Jake said with a shrug. trying to downplay the strange, surreal connection he felt. Alyssa smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. "Take care, Jake." And with that, she drove away, leaving Jake standing by the roadside, water dripping from his clothes as he watched her disappear down the winding road. That day marked a turning point in both their lives, though neither of them could have guessed how deeply their paths would intertwine. For Jake, the memory of Alyssa lingered, a beautiful, mysterious girl who had briefly crossed into his world. For Alyssa, the image of Jake pulling her from the water stayed with her, a boy whose courage and selflessness had shattered the expectations she'd grown up with. Little did they know, the ripples from that lake would grow into waves that would change their lives forever. The line crossed. Jake returned home that morning, dripping wet and filled with questions. He slipped inside the modest house he shared with his mother, Linda, careful not to wake her after her late shift at the motel. He changed into dry clothes and sat by the window, watching the town slowly wake up. Alyssa Davenport's face lingered in his mind. Her wide blue eyes, the fear etched into her expression, and the gratitude in her voice. He tried to shake it off. "She's from another world," Jake muttered to himself. He had no illusions about where he stood in Crestwood's unspoken hierarchy. People like Alyssa didn't mix with people like him. And yet, something about their encounter felt different. Genuine. Life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after saving the richest girl in town. Jake's days were filled with school, work, and helping his mom. But in the quiet moments, his mind would drift back to Alyssa. Had she told anyone about what happened? Did she even remember him? He couldn't imagine she'd give him another thought. Alyssa Davenport, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about Jake. She lay awake at night replaying the moment he dove into the lake without hesitation, risking himself for her. No one in her world behaved that way. The people around her, her father's business associates, her so-called friends, always had an agenda. But Jake had saved her simply because she needed help, and then he brushed it off like it was nothing. That kind of authenticity was rare in Alyssa's life. Her days were filled with rigid schedules, carefully curated social appearances, and the suffocating weight of her father's expectations. Her mother had passed away when Alyssa was young, leaving her father to mold her into his perfect successor. Ethan Davenport didn't see her as a person with dreams and desires. He saw her as an extension of himself. Alyssa wanted more. She dreamed of becoming an artist, painting the landscapes of Europe, and breaking free from the gilded cage her father had built around her. But she knew that as long as she stayed in Crestwood, those dreams would remain out of reach. Meeting Jake had ignited something in her, a spark of hope, a reminder that there were people in the world who lived authentically, not bound by money or status. She couldn't let it end there. Jake was stocking shelves at the grocery store when it happened. The bell above the door chimed, and he glanced up to see Alyssa Davenport walking in. He froze, a can of soup in his hand, as she scanned the store and walked directly toward him. "Alyssa," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hi, Jake." She smiled, but there was a nervous energy to her. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Jake set the can down, his heart racing. "What are you doing here?" "I came to see you," Alyssa said, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "I wanted to thank you properly." "You already did," Jake said, feeling acutely aware of the curious stares from the other customers and his coworkers. "You don't have to do this." "I want to," Alyssa insisted. She glanced around and lowered her voice. "Do you have a break soon? Maybe we could talk." Jake hesitated. This felt dangerous. The line between their worlds was clear, and Alyssa was crossing it without a second thought. But her earnest expression disarmed him. Against his better judgment, he nodded. "Give me 10 minutes." 10 minutes later, they were sitting on a bench outside the store. The summer sun cast long shadows, and the scent of freshly cut grass filled the air. Jake kept his hands clasped tightly, unsure of what to say. "I'm sorry if this is weird," Alyssa began. I couldn't stop thinking about what you did for me. You didn't even hesitate, Jake. You saved my life, and then you acted like it was no big deal. Because it wasn't, Jake said, shrugging. I just did what anyone would do. No, Alyssa said firmly, her blue eyes locking onto his. Not anyone would do that. People in my world don't do things without expecting something in return. But you're different. Jake looked away, uncomfortable under her gaze. I don't know about that. Well, I do, Alyssa said. And I want to get to know you, Jake, if that's okay. Jake blinked, taken aback. Why? Because I like you, Alyssa said simply. And I think we could be friends. Jake laughed, shaking his head. Alyssa, you and I live in two different worlds. People like you don't hang out with people like me. Maybe it's time that changed, Alyssa said, her voice full of quiet determination. I don't care what people think, do you? Jake hesitated. He did care. He cared because he knew how cruel people could be. But as he looked at Alyssa, he saw something he hadn't expected. Sincerity. She wasn't here out of pity or obligation. She genuinely wanted to be his friend. Okay, Jake said finally, but don't say I didn't warn you. Alyssa grinned, and for a moment, Jake forgot about the gulf between their worlds. The days that followed were unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. Alyssa began showing up at the grocery store, offering to walk home with him after his shifts. They talked about everything. School, their dreams, their frustrations with life. Jake opened up about his father, about the responsibility he felt to take care of his mom. Alyssa confessed her fear of disappointing her father, her secret passion for painting, and her dream of studying art in Europe. Their bond grew stronger, and soon they were inseparable. They found comfort in each other's company, a refuge from the pressures of their respective lives. But their growing connection didn't go unnoticed. Whispers began to spread around Crestwood. Jake overheard customers at the store speculating about why Alyssa Davenport, the richest girl in town, was spending time with a grocery clerk. At school, his classmates mocked him, calling him Alyssa's charity case. Even his coworkers began treating him differently, their teasing laced with envy. Alyssa faced her own challenges. Her father, Ethan Davenport, was livid when he learned about her new friendship. You're a Davenport, he said, his voice cold and commanding. People like him are beneath you. But Alyssa didn't back down. Jake saved my life, Dad. He's a good person. You'd know that if you ever bothered to meet him. Ethan's jaw tightened. This ends now, Alyssa. I won't have you tarnishing our family's reputation. But Alyssa was done living under her father's thumb. You don't control me, she said, her voice steady. I'll see whoever I want. Ethan's eyes narrowed. If you continue down this path, Alyssa, don't expect my support. Alyssa's heart ached, but she refused to let her father dictate her life. She walked out of the mansion that night and found herself at the park, where Jake was waiting. He saw the pain in her eyes and knew something had happened. What's wrong? Jake asked, his voice full of concern. Alyssa sat beside him on the bench, the same bench where they had first started talking. My dad found out about us, she said. He's furious. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. Maybe he's right, Alyssa. Maybe this, us, it's not a good idea. Alyssa turned to him, her eyes blazing. Don't you dare say that, Jake. I don't care what he thinks. I care about you. Jake's heart ached at her words. He cared about her too, more than he wanted to admit, but the weight of their worlds threatened to crush them. I'm scared, Alyssa, Jake confessed. I'm scared of what this could do to you. To us. Alyssa reached for his hand, her grip firm and steady. Then let's face it together. Jake looked into her eyes and saw a determination that mirrored his own. For the first time, he allowed himself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to bridge the gap between their worlds. Together. Secrets and sacrifices. The days following Alyssa's confrontation with her father were a whirlwind of emotions for both her and Jake. Crestwood, a town that thrived on gossip, had turned their budding friendship into the talk of the town. Everywhere Jake went, he felt the weight of stares and the sharp edge of whispered words. Alyssa, for her part, faced a different kind of scrutiny, her father's icy silence, and the judgment of her privileged social circle. Yet, through it all, they found solace in each other's company, forging a bond that grew stronger with every challenge. One late afternoon, Jake sat on the porch of his small house, repairing the chain on his old bicycle. The sun was low in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over Crestwood. He heard the familiar hum of a car engine and looked up to see Alyssa's sleek convertible pulling up to the curb. She stepped out, her expression a mix of determination and excitement. "Jake," she called, waving as she approached. "Alyssa," he replied, standing and wiping his hands on his jeans. "What are you doing here?" "I have something to show you," she said, her eyes sparkling with a hint of mischief. "Come on." Jake hesitated, glancing back at the house. "I can't just leave. My mom's. She'll be fine for a little while." Alyssa interrupted, grabbing his hand. "This is important. Trust me." Jake sighed but let her pull him toward the car. He slid into the passenger seat, the plush leather a stark contrast to anything he'd ever experienced. Alyssa took off, the wind whipping through her hair as she navigated the winding roads of Crestwood with ease. "Where are we going?" Jake asked, leaning into the door as they picked up speed. "You'll see," Alyssa said cryptically, her smile widening. They drove for about 20 minutes, leaving the familiar streets of town behind and heading toward the outskirts. Eventually, Alyssa turned onto a narrow gravel road that led to a clearing by one of the larger lakes. The car came to a stop, and she hopped out, gesturing for Jake to follow. "What is this place?" Jake asked, stepping out and taking in the view. The lake stretched wide and serene, its surface shimmering in the fading light. Tall trees framed the clearing, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. "This is where I come when I need to escape," Alyssa said, walking toward the water's edge. "My dad doesn't know about it. It's the one place that feels like mine." Jake followed her, his curiosity piqued. "Why do you bring me here?" Alyssa turned to face him, her expression serious now. "Because I want you to know that you're not just a passing phase for me, Jake. I'm not spending time with you to rebel against my dad, or because I'm bored. I'm here because I want to be." Jake felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't used to hearing words like that, let alone from someone like Alyssa. "Alyssa, Wait," she interrupted, holding up a hand. "There's more." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small canvas, setting it on an easel she had brought from the car. Jake watched as she began to unpack paints and brushes, her movements fluid and practiced. "I wanted to show you something," Alyssa said, dipping a brush into a vibrant blue. She began to paint, her strokes deliberate and confident. Jake stood back, watching in awe as the blank canvas transformed under her hands. The image that emerged was a vivid depiction of the lake where they'd first met, the calm water, the surrounding trees, and in the center, two figures standing together. "That's us," Jake said, his voice filled with wonder. Alyssa nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "It's how I see us. Two people from different worlds meeting in the middle." Jake stared at the painting, his chest tight with emotion. No one had ever done anything like this for him before. "Alyssa, it's beautiful. You're incredible." Alyssa laughed, a light, genuine sound. "You're just saying that because I painted you." "No," Jake said firmly, meeting her gaze. "I mean it." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Jake spoke. "You know this isn't going to be easy, right? People are already talking. Your dad hates me." Alyssa sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I know, but I don't care what they think. Jake, you're worth it." Jake felt his heart swell at her words, but the practical part of him couldn't ignore the reality of their situation. And what happens when it gets too hard? when the pressure gets to be too much. Alyssa stepped closer, her eyes locked onto his. Then we fight. Together. As the weeks passed, their bond deepened, but so did the challenges they faced. Alyssa's father grew more determined to separate them, using every tool at his disposal. He pressured Alyssa with veiled threats, warning her that she'd lose her inheritance if she continued seeing Jake. He even tried to dig into Jake's past, hoping to find something that would discredit him. Meanwhile, Jake faced a different kind of pressure. At school, the whispers turned into outright hostility. One day, as he walked to his locker, he found a group of boys waiting for him. Their leader, Trent, leaned against the metal doors with a smug grin. Well, if it isn't Crestwood's newest celebrity," Trent said, his tone dripping with mockery. "How's life in the spotlight, Jake?" Jake ignored him, trying to push past, but Trent stepped in his way. "What's the matter? Too good to talk to us now that you're dating a Davenport." "I'm not dating her," Jake said evenly, though his hands clenched into fists. "Sure you're not," Trent sneered. "Let me guess, she's just your ticket out of this dump, right? Playing the long game." Jake's temper flared, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You don't know anything about her. Or me." Trent's grin widened. "You're right. I don't. But I do know one thing. People like her don't stick around for people like you. She'll get bored, and when she does, you'll be back where you started." Jake shoved past him, his heart pounding with anger and frustration. He wanted to prove Trent wrong, but the doubts he'd voiced earlier to Alyssa began creeping back into his mind. Was he fooling himself? Could they really make this work? That evening, Jake sat on the porch, staring out at the quiet street. Alyssa had sent him a text earlier, asking if he wanted to meet, but he hadn't replied. He wasn't sure what to say. The weight of everything, the rumors, the judgment, the obstacles, was starting to feel unbearable. As he sat there, lost in thought, his mother stepped out onto the porch. Linda was a petite woman with kind eyes and a weariness that came from years of hard work. She sat beside Jake, her hands folded in her lap. "You've been quiet lately," she said gently. "Something on your mind?" Jake hesitated, then sighed. "It's complicated." Linda smiled faintly. "Most things worth having are." Jake looked at her, his brow furrowed. "What if it's too complicated? What if it's not worth it?" Linda reached over, placing a hand on his. "Only you can decide that, Jake. But if this girl makes you happy, if she sees you for who you really are, then maybe it's worth fighting for." Jake nodded slowly, her words sinking in. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing. He wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the street in shadow, Jake made a silent promise to himself. No matter how hard it got, he would fight for Alyssa, because she was worth it. And deep down, he believed they were worth it too. Storms and shields. The sun rose over Crestwood, casting a golden glow on the quiet town. Jake stood in front of the grocery store, the morning air crisp as he loaded a delivery truck with boxes of canned goods. His hands moved mechanically, but his mind was elsewhere, on Alyssa, on the mounting tension, and on what their connection had come to mean. "Yo, Jake," his coworker Mason called from the back of the truck. "You've been zoning out all morning. What's going on?" "Thinking about your princess." Jake frowned, feeling the familiar prick of judgment. "Not now, Mason," he muttered. "Hey, I'm just saying," Mason said with a smirk. "Must be nice, hanging out with someone like her. Bet she's got her whole world laid out on a silver platter." Jake clenched his fists but said nothing. Mason's words, though laced with envy, echoed a fear Jake couldn't shake. How long could two people from such different worlds hold on before everything fell apart? Across town, Alyssa sat at her vanity, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She'd spent the morning dodging her father's questions, his icy disapproval cutting through the thin veneer of civility in their household. Ethan Davenport had made it abundantly clear that her friendship with Jake was unacceptable, But Alyssa wasn't backing down. She reached for her phone and typed a quick message. "Meet me at the clearing after work." Jake's reply came almost instantly. "I'll be there." Alyssa exhaled, relief washing over her. She didn't know what she'd do without Jake, the one person who saw her for who she truly was, not the carefully curated image her father insisted on presenting to the world. That evening, Jake arrived at the clearing by the lake, the same place Alyssa had brought him weeks ago. She was already there, sitting cross-legged on a blanket, her sketchpad balanced on her knees. When she saw him, she smiled, a small, genuine expression that made his heart ache with its simplicity. "Hey," she said as he sat down beside her. "Rough day." "You could say that," Jake replied, stretching out on the blanket. "You?" Alyssa laughed humorlessly. "Same. My dad's been relentless." Jake turned to her, concern etched into his features. "What's he saying now?" "Oh, the usual," Alyssa said with a shrug. "You're throwing away your future. He's just using you. You'll regret this." Her voice took on a mocking tone, but her eyes betrayed the hurt behind the words. "It's exhausting." Jake reached over, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm sorry, Alyssa. I wish I could make it easier for you." "You do," she said softly. "Just being here with you makes it easier." They sat in silence for a moment, the sound of the water lapping against the shore filling the air. Jake wanted to say something comforting, something that would erase the doubt and pain Alyssa was carrying. But before he could, she spoke again. "I'm scared, Jake," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not of my dad or the rumors, but of losing this. Losing us." Jake's chest tightened. He'd been trying to push those same fears aside, but hearing Alyssa voice them made them impossible to ignore. "We're not going anywhere," he said, his voice firm. "No matter what happens, we'll figure it out. Together." Alyssa looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Promise." "Promise," Jake said, taking her hand in his. "But we need to be smart about this. Your dad's not going to stop, and the more we let people get to us, the harder it'll be." Alyssa nodded, her grip on his hand tightening. "You're right. So what do we do?" "We fight back," Jake said, a steely determination in his voice. "Not with words or arguments, but by showing them that they're wrong. That this, us, means something." In the days that followed, Jake and Alyssa threw themselves into their respective lives with renewed focus. Jake doubled down on his studies, determined to prove that he was more than the poor kid from Crestwood. Alyssa, meanwhile, began showcasing her art in local galleries, using her talent to carve out an identity separate from her father's shadow. Their efforts didn't go unnoticed. At school, Jake's teachers praised his work ethic, and his classmates, though still wary, began to see him in a new light. Alyssa's art drew attention from critics and collectors, earning her a reputation as more than just a rich girl with a hobby. But as their successes grew, so did the challenges. Ethan Davenport wasn't one to back down, and his efforts to undermine Jake became more calculated. One evening, as Jake was leaving the grocery store, he was approached by a man in a tailored suit. "Mr. Collins," the man said, extending a hand. "I'm David Reardon, one of Mr. Davenport's associates. May I have a moment of your time?" Jake hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to walk away. But curiosity got the better of him. "What do you want?" Reardon smiled, a practiced, professional expression. "Mr. Davenport has taken a keen interest in your relationship with his daughter. He asked me to offer you an opportunity." Jake's jaw tightened. "I'm not interested." "Perhaps you should be," Reardon said smoothly, pulling out an envelope and handing it to Jake. "This is a generous sum, more than enough to help your mother and secure your future. All we ask is that you walk away from Alyssa." Jake stared at the envelope, anger boiling in his chest. "You think you can buy me off?" "I think you're a smart young man," Reardon said, his tone patronizing. "And I think you understand what's at stake here. Refusing this offer would be unwise." Jake's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Tell Mr. Davenport he can keep his money. I'm not for sale." Reardon's smile faltered, replaced by a look of mild annoyance. "Suit yourself, Mr. Collins, but don't say we didn't warn you." Jake watched as Reardon walked away, his blood boiling. He knew the offer was just the beginning, that Ethan Davenport would stop at nothing to separate him from Alyssa. But if they thought he'd back down, they were sorely mistaken. That night, Jake told Alyssa about the encounter, her face flushing with anger as he recounted Reardon's words. "I can't believe him," she said, pacing back and forth. "He thinks he can control everything." "He doesn't control me," Jake said firmly. "And he doesn't control you." Alyssa stopped pacing and looked at him, her expression softening. "Thank you, Jake, for standing up to him." Jake smiled faintly. "I'm not going to let anyone come between us, Alyssa. Not your dad. Not anyone." Alyssa crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. "I don't deserve you," she murmured. "Yes, you do," Jake said, holding her tightly. "And I'll keep proving it every day." As they stood there, the storm outside raging against the windows, Jake and Alyssa made an unspoken vow to face whatever came next. Together, the fight for freedom. The tension between Jake and Alyssa's worlds continued to build, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Crestwood buzzed with rumors about the two of them, their unlikely bond making them the town's favorite topic of conversation. But while whispers and stares were easy to ignore, the direct confrontations became harder to brush off. Jake had started walking home a different way to avoid Trent and his crew, but trouble had a way of finding him. One afternoon, as he left the grocery store, Trent and his friends were waiting near the alley. "Well, look who it is," Trent sneered, stepping into Jake's path. Crestwood's very own Cinderella story. Jake sighed, his patience wearing thin. "Not today, Trent." "Oh, come on," Trent said, blocking his way. "I just want to know how you're pulling this off. What's your secret? Blackmail? Bribery?" Jake ignored him, trying to step around, but another boy shoved him back. "We're talking to you, Collins." Jake clenched his fists, his anger bubbling to the surface. "Leave me alone." "Or what?" Trent taunted, his grin widening. "You think Davenport's going to come rescue you? Face it, Jake. You're just her charity project. Everyone knows it." The comment stung, but Jake refused to let them see it. "Believe what you want," he said, pushing past them. "But stay out of my way." Trent didn't follow, but his mocking laughter echoed behind Jake as he walked away, his chest tight with frustration. He hated that people like Trent thought they could define him. But more than that, he hated the tiny voice in his head that asked if they were right. Across town, Alyssa faced her own battles. Her father's disapproval had turned into outright hostility. Ethan Davenport was a man who rarely lost, and his determination to sever Alyssa's connection with Jake had reached new heights. One evening, Alyssa came home to find her father waiting for her in his office. His expression was cold, his hands steepled on the mahogany desk. "Sit," he ordered, his tone brooking no argument. Alyssa sat reluctantly, her arms crossed. "What now?" Ethan slid a stack of papers across the desk toward her. "This is a trust agreement. Sign it, and I'll release the funds for your college education, your living expenses, everything. But there's a condition." Alyssa picked up the papers, her eyes scanning the text. Her stomach turned when she reached the stipulation. The beneficiary agrees to cease all contact with Jacob Collins. She slammed the papers down. "You've got to be kidding me." "I'm not," Ethan said, his voice cold. "This is your last chance, Alyssa. I've tolerated this nonsense long enough. You sign, or you find out what it's like to live without my support." Alyssa's hands trembled with rage, but she forced herself to meet her father's gaze. "You think you can control me with money?" "I think I've indulged your whims long enough," Ethan said. "You're my daughter, Alyssa. You have responsibilities. A legacy. This boy doesn't fit into that." Alyssa stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This boy saved my life. He's more of a man than you'll ever be." Ethan's face reddened, but before he could respond, Alyssa turned on her heel and stormed out of the office. She didn't stop until she was in her car, tears blurring her vision as she drove toward the one place she felt safe. Jake was sitting at the kitchen table, helping his mom sort through bills, when he heard a knock at the door. He opened it to find Alyssa standing there, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. "Alyssa," he said, his concern immediate. "What happened?" She stepped inside, her voice trembling as she recounted the confrontation with her father. Jake listened in silence, his jaw tightening with every word. When she finished, she looked up at him, her expression raw. "I don't know what to do, Jake." Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You don't have to do anything, Alyssa. This isn't your fault." "But it is," she said, her voice cracking. "I brought you into this. If I just—" "Stop," Jake interrupted, his tone firm. "You didn't bring me into anything. I'm here because I want to be. And I'm not going anywhere." Alyssa's eyes filled with fresh tears. But this time, there was relief in her expression. "Thank you, Jake." Jake pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly as she cried into his shoulder. He didn't know how they were going to navigate this storm, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let her face it alone. The next day, Alyssa made a decision. She gathered her paintings, loaded them into her car, and drove to the Crestwood Community Center. She approached the director, an older woman named Mrs. Vaughn, with a bold request. "I'd like to host an art exhibition," Alyssa said. "For free." Mrs. Vaughn raised an eyebrow. "Free?" "Yes," Alyssa said. "I'll cover the costs. I just want people to see my work." Mrs. Vaughn studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, let's make it happen." Over the next week, Alyssa threw herself into preparing for the exhibition. She painted day and night, pouring her heart into every piece. Each canvas told a story of love, struggle, and hope, and in the center of it all was a painting of the lake where she and Jake had first met. The night of the exhibition, the community center was packed. People from all over Crestwood came to see Alyssa's work, their curiosity piqued by the buzz surrounding the event. Among them was Jake, who stood in the back of the room, his heart swelling with pride as he watched Alyssa greet visitors with grace and confidence. As the evening wore on, Alyssa made her way to Jake, her smile lighting up the room. "You came," she said. "Of course I did," Jake replied. "You're amazing, Alyssa." She blushed, glancing down at her hands. "I couldn't have done this without you, Jake. You gave me the courage to be myself." Jake reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "And you remind me why it's worth fighting for." Across the room, Ethan Davenport stood in the shadows, watching the exchange with a conflicted expression. For the first time, he saw his daughter not as an extension of himself, but as her own person, a young woman with passion, strength, and a will he couldn't break. He left the exhibition without a word, the weight of his actions pressing heavily on his shoulders. That night, as Jake and Alyssa sat by the lake, the stars reflected in the water, they talked about the future. They didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but for the first time, they felt hopeful. "We'll figure it out," Jake said, his voice steady. "No matter what." Alyssa smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. Together. And as the night stretched on, they sat in peaceful silence, the storms of the world momentarily at bay. For now, they had each other, and that was enough. Breaking the chains. The aftermath of Alyssa's art exhibition rippled through Crestwood, leaving a trail of whispered admiration and thinly veiled envy. Her talent was undeniable, and for many in the town, it was the first time they saw Alyssa Davenport as more than just the privileged daughter of a real estate mogul. Jake, standing quietly by her side that night, was proud, but also acutely aware of the growing tension between their worlds. The exhibition may have earned Alyssa respect from strangers, but it also deepened the rift between her and her father. 2 weeks later, the consequences of their defiance began to unfold. Ethan Davenport wasn't used to losing. For years, his wealth and influence had allowed him to manipulate the world around him, bending people to his will. But Alyssa's refusal to bow to his demands, combined with her growing independence, was a blow to his carefully constructed image of control. In his sprawling office overlooking Crestwood, Ethan sat at his desk, reviewing the stack of documents. The door opened, and David Reardon, his trusted associate, walked in, carrying a thick folder. "Sir," Reardon began, setting the folder on the desk, "we've compiled a detailed report on Jacob Collins. It's thorough, but—" He hesitated. Ethan glanced up, his expression sharp. "But what?" Reardon sighed. "There's nothing damning in it. The boy's clean. No criminal record, no suspicious activity. He's a hard worker, good grades, well-liked by his teachers. If anything, he's remarkably unremarkable." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Everyone has a weakness, Reardon. Find his." Reardon nodded and left the room, but Ethan's frustration lingered. If he couldn't destroy Jake's reputation, he'd have to find another way to break him. A more direct approach. Jake was walking home from school one afternoon when he noticed a familiar black car parked outside his house. His stomach sank. He quickened his pace, his heart pounding as he approached the porch. Inside, he found Ethan Davenport sitting stiffly on the worn couch, his suit an uncomfortable contrast to the modest surroundings. Linda Collins, Jake's mother, stood in the kitchen, her face pale as she gripped the edge of the counter. She looked up as Jake entered, relief flickering across her features. "Jake," she said quietly, "Mr. Davenport wanted to speak with you." Jake stepped forward, his fists clenched. "What are you doing here?" Ethan stood, towering over Jake. "I'm here to make this simple. You're going to end whatever this is with my daughter." Jake glared at him. "No, I'm not." Ethan's expression darkened. "You think you're in love. Let me tell you how this ends. Alyssa will get tired of playing rebel, and when she does, you'll be left with nothing. Worse than nothing, because I will ensure you and your mother lose everything." Jake's blood boiled. "You think you can threaten me into walking away? You don't scare me." "Maybe not," Ethan said, his voice icy. "But I can make life very difficult for the people you care about. Do you want your mother to lose her job? Do you want her to lose this house?" "Get out," Jake growled, his voice shaking with anger. Ethan smirked, his victory seeming assured. "Remember this, Jake. People like you don't win against people like me." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving a tense silence in his wake. Linda approached Jake, her voice trembling. "Jake, what have you gotten yourself into?" Jake turned to her, his face set with determination. "Nothing I can't handle, Mom. He's not going to scare me away." Linda placed a hand on his arm. "You're brave, Jake. But be careful. People like him, they don't play fair." Alyssa's reaction to her father's visit was explosive. She confronted Ethan in the grand dining room of their mansion, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "How dare you go to Jake's house?" she demanded. "How dare you threaten his family?" Ethan remained seated, sipping a glass of wine. "I did what I had to do." "No, you did what you always do," Alyssa shot back. "You tried to control someone else's life because you can't stand the idea of not getting your way." Ethan set the glass down, his patience wearing thin. "I'm trying to protect you, Alyssa. That boy has nothing to offer you." "Except honesty, kindness, and courage," Alyssa retorted. "Things you wouldn't recognize if they hit you in the face." Ethan's face reddened, but before he could respond, Alyssa turned and stormed out of the room. She wasn't going to let him dictate her life any longer. As the weeks passed, Jake and Alyssa worked harder than ever to build a future that was theirs alone. Jake picked up extra shifts at the grocery store, saving every penny he could. He began applying for scholarships, determined to pay his own way through college. Meanwhile, Alyssa poured her energy into her art, selling paintings and building a network of supporters who believed in her vision. But the weight of Ethan's threats loomed over them. Jake worried constantly about his mother's job, about their home, about whether he could truly shield the people he loved from the fallout of their defiance. One evening, as Jake and Alyssa sat by the lake, he voiced his fears. "What if this doesn't work, Alyssa? What if we can't beat him?" Alyssa took his hand, her grip firm. "We will, Jake, because we have something he doesn't, each other, and we're not alone. People believe in us. We just have to keep fighting." Her words gave Jake strength, but he knew their battle was far from over. The turning point came unexpectedly. One of Alyssa's paintings, a bold, emotional piece titled "Breaking Free," caught the attention of a renowned art critic visiting a nearby gallery. The critic wrote a glowing review, calling Alyssa a rising star with a unique voice. The article went viral, and suddenly Alyssa's work was in demand far beyond Crestwood. Ethan tried to downplay her success, but the truth was undeniable. Alyssa didn't need his money or his connections. She was carving out her own path, and there was nothing he could do to stop her. Jake, too, found his efforts paying off. He won a full scholarship to a prestigious engineering program, his hard work and determination earning him a place in a world he'd only dreamed of. Together, they faced Ethan one last time. They stood in his office, side by side, as Alyssa delivered the final blow. "We don't need you, Dad," she said, her voice steady. "Not your approval, not your money, not your influence. We're going to be okay without you." Ethan stared at them, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. For the first time, he realized he'd lost. Not just the battle, but the respect of his daughter. And as Alyssa and Jake walked out of his office, their hands clasped tightly, Ethan was left alone with his shattered pride. Months later, Jake and Alyssa stood on the platform of the train station, ready to begin the next chapter of their lives. Alyssa was heading to an art school in New York, and Jake was off to a university across the state. They hugged tightly, their hearts full of hope and determination. "We did it," Jake said, his voice filled with awe. "We did," Alyssa replied, her eyes shining. "And this is just the beginning." As the train pulled away, they waved to each other, their bond unbroken despite the distance. They had faced the storms and come out stronger. And as they moved forward, they carried with them the knowledge that love, courage, and resilience could break even the strongest chains. A final stand. Jake and Alyssa's lives moved forward, but the shadow of Ethan Davenport loomed large. Despite their individual successes, the man's wealth and influence were not easily shaken. Ethan, unwilling to accept defeat, quietly began working behind the scenes to undermine them. His tactics became more subtle, but no less damaging. Whispers to gallery owners about Alyssa's instability, quiet inquiries to scholarship boards questioning Jake's character. He was relentless, but so were they. One rainy afternoon, as Jake sat in the living room of their small house, a letter arrived. His mother handed it to him with a concerned look. The letter bore the crest of his scholarship board. Jake's hands trembled as he opened it, dread settling in his stomach. "Dear Mr. Collins, we regret to inform you that recent concerns regarding your application have prompted a review of your scholarship status. We will require additional documentation to verify your eligibility." Jake's heart sank. He knew this was Ethan's doing. He looked up at his mother, who was watching him with worry etched into her face. "They're trying to take it away," Jake said, his voice thick with frustration. Linda placed a hand on his shoulder. "Jake, you've worked too hard for this. Don't let them win." Jake nodded, determination hardening his resolve. "I won't." Meanwhile, Alyssa faced her own battles. Her newfound recognition in the art world came with scrutiny, and the rumors seeded by her father began to spread. A gallery owner canceled a planned exhibit, citing professional concerns. A potential buyer pulled out of a major sale after hearing whispers of family issues. Alyssa knew exactly who was behind it. She sat at her easel that night, staring at a blank canvas, her hands clenched into fists. Every stroke she made felt inadequate, tainted by the weight of her father's interference. For the first time, doubt began to creep into her mind. Jake found her in the studio the next day, her usually vibrant energy dulled. "What's wrong?" he asked, sitting beside her. "My father," she said bitterly. "He's not just hurting me. He's trying to destroy everything I've built." Jake reached for her hand. "He's trying to scare you. He thinks if he takes away what you've worked for, you'll come running back to him." "Well, it's working," Alyssa admitted, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to fight this, Jake." Jake leaned closer, his eyes full of fierce determination. "You fight it by doing what you do best, proving him wrong. Show the world who you are, Alyssa. Don't let him take that from you." Alyssa met his gaze, finding strength in his unwavering support. "You're right," she said softly, "but I can't do it alone." Jake smiled. "You're not alone." Their turning point came when Alyssa's art mentor, an established painter named Isabella Marlowe, reached out to her. Isabella had seen Alyssa's work and was impressed by her raw talent and emotional depth. She invited Alyssa to showcase her paintings in a high-profile gallery in New York City. The opportunity was a lifeline, and Alyssa threw herself into her work, creating a series of pieces that reflected her journey, her struggles with her father, her relationship with Jake, and her determination to break free. Each painting told a story, and together, they formed a powerful narrative of resilience and defiance. Jake, inspired by Alyssa's resolve, worked tirelessly to address the scholarship board's concerns. He gathered letters of recommendation from teachers, employers, and community members who vouched for his character and work ethic. He even met with the board in person, presenting his case with confidence and integrity. Slowly but surely, they began to reclaim their futures. The night of Alyssa's gallery opening was a pivotal moment. The room was packed with art enthusiasts, critics, and collectors, all drawn by the buzz surrounding her work. Each painting captivated the audience, but one piece in particular stole the show, a hauntingly beautiful depiction of two figures standing on opposite sides of a chasm, their hands reaching for each other across the void. Jake stood beside Alyssa as the crowd admired her work, his heart swelling with pride. "You did it," he whispered. "We did it," Alyssa corrected, her voice full of emotion. She turned to him, her eyes shining. "Thank you, Jake, for everything." Before Jake could respond, a familiar figure entered the gallery. Ethan Davenport, dressed impeccably as always, surveyed the room with a calculating gaze. Alyssa stiffened at the sight of him, her confidence wavering. Jake placed a reassuring hand on her back. "You've got this." Ethan approached them, his expression unreadable. He stopped in front of the painting of the chasm, his eyes lingering on the two figures. After a long moment, he turned to Alyssa. "This is impressive," he said, his tone neutral. Alyssa straightened, her chin lifting. "Thank you." Ethan's gaze shifted to Jake. "I underestimated you," he admitted, though his tone lacked warmth. "Both of you." Jake met his eyes without flinching. "We're not here to prove anything to you." Ethan smirked faintly. "Maybe not, but you've proven it nonetheless." With that, he walked away, leaving Alyssa and Jake to wonder if they'd finally won, or if this was just another game. In the months that followed, Alyssa's career soared. Her New York exhibition led to more opportunities, and her paintings began to fetch significant prices. Jake's scholarship was reinstated, and he excelled in his engineering program, earning accolades for his innovative designs. Though their paths diverged geographically, their bond remained unbreakable. They visited each other often, their time together filled with laughter, love, and shared dreams of a future where their worlds no longer clashed. On a quiet evening by the lake where their story began, Jake and Alyssa sat together, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Alyssa leaned her head on Jake's shoulder, her voice soft as she said, "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" "Every day," Jake replied, his arm wrapping around her. "And I can't wait to see where we go next." Alyssa smiled, her heart full of gratitude. Despite the challenges they'd faced, they had built something beautiful together, something that no amount of money, power, or opposition could destroy. And as the stars began to dot the sky, they knew one thing for certain. Their love had not only survived but thrived, proving that even in the face of adversity, the human spirit could prevail. Together, they were unstoppable.